Okay, welcome everyone to the first session of our annual conference on economics and public policy. My name is Subhasish. I'll be the moderator for this session. I'm an associate professor at Jsgp. I'll say a couple of things, but before that, I'd like to introduce Sanchita Debnath, who is the rapporteur for this session. She's a PhD student at Jsgp. Sanchita, a few words about yourself, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm pursuing my PhD from JSGP. I'm a second year PhD student. And my topic is on renewable energy and public policy, determining the social hierarchies that are formed in the energy transition. I'm very happy to be here, and all the best for a very successful annual conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanchita. You know, the few words that I wanted to say is I wanted to just sort of start by just a huge round of thanks to the two conference organizers, Shivangi and Geeta, assistant professors at GSGP, for putting this together. I have seen them through this whole process, and it is very difficult to do something like this. I mean, making sort of, getting papers, getting all the folks together, arranging the times and so on. But they have done this remarkably. And this first panel, actually, I mean, that's something I wanted to say. I mean, this is a good example of how well they've done. I mean, I was looking at the papers, how well they hang together. Each paper looks at the impact of COVID-19 on the Indian economy. But each of them does so in very, very different ways. So you have Ritika's paper, Ritika and our co-author, their paper, which uses an empirical sort of, a difference approach to look at, firm profitability. You have Sushobhan Mahata's paper, which looks at migration decisions, where this is a purely formal theory paper, math modeling paper. And then you have Nisha Vernekar's paper with her co-authors, where they're using qualitative methods to understand, effect on early childhood education. And and I myself have started doing some research on COVID-19, on mental health and so on. So I just feel like, this is such a well put together panel. And you can look at the other parts of the conference as well. You see exactly the same thing, very nicely put together a paper. So thank you very much. And without further ado, I will invite Ritika, who is our first presenter. So to all the presenters, we have the plan is 20 minutes per presentation and then half an hour for Q&A. Now around the 18th minute mark, Sanchita will use the raise hands icon to give you a reminder that you have 2 more minutes to wrap up. And so I'd really appreciate that you keep to the time because I think there are so many, this is so interesting. I've looked at some of the papers today. You must have the 30 minutes of Q&A because I think there's lots to talk about here. So thank you very much. So Ritika, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Subhasish. Please confirm if you can hear me, like my audio is clear.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, great. One more thing, I hope I can see the raise hand because I'll be in my presentation mode. In case I'm not responding to it, I would request Sanchita to just like say, ma'am, 2 minutes or whatever. I think that would work really good. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Yeah. Is my presentation visible and loaded properly?
Yes.
Screen mode?
You can make it full screen.
Yes.
We still have, yeah.
That's fine. Okay. Thank you to the conference organizers for giving us a chance to discuss this work. The topic is effect of COVID-19 lockdown on the profitability of firms in India, and it's a co-authored work with Rajnish Kumar, who is heading the ISS department of ESG movement. Now, what I'll do is I'll just take you briefly through the introductory slides because most of us know the context. But the main thing that we need to keep in mind is that because COVID-19 brought in a series of lockdowns across a lot of economies, we know that lockdowns, while they are very effective in averting health adversities, but they do have economic costs. And when we focus on developing economies, after the lockdown, the uphill battle of reviving economic activity goes beyond just the revival of demand and supply conditions because of several factors such as informal constraints, weak infrastructure, and so on and so on. Now, when we're talking about India, India had been exhibiting a slowdown in economic growth even before COVID-19. There were a lot of signs. You had negative growth rate in rural consumption, record high rates of unemployment, and so on and so forth. Now, in such a situation, even the manufacturing sector had actually been slowing down. So in such a situation, when a lockdown is implemented, it may have acted as a brake. It is against this background that what we are trying to do is we're just trying to examine the effect of COVID-19 induced lockdown on firm profitability in India. It's a very simple paper in that sense, and we're just trying to find out some estimate measure of how much was the drop in profitability. I'm not going to focus a lot on the review of literature, but overall, the thing is that most of the papers till date have focused on the stock market performance, and rightly so, because you do not have the operational indicators out yet. But of late, there are a few papers, and most of it have emphasized on the role of pre-existing factors or the institutional factors on how much the effect of lockdown on performance has been. Just to give us a very brief snapshot of the study, what we are doing is we're developing an empirical strategy based on the difference in difference estimation framework. We're using data from Travis, using a set of measures related to profitability. And what we find is that there is a drastic fall. We try to discuss some of the potential channels of the result. And we also extend the main results by incorporating the spatial variation at the subnational level when it comes to the stringency of lockdown and also the rate of spread of COVID-19 infection. We'll try to develop the hypothesis again a little briefly because we are a little short of time, right? So when we're trying to examine the effect of a lockdown, it is important to focus on it from the supply side separately and then on the demand side. On the supply side, again, when we think of the manufacturing sector, we know that there would be decline in production volumes for the simple reason that there is restrictions on mobility of labor, there's restrictions on raw material, transport, and so on and so forth. But on the services side, the effect will probably be heterogeneous. Why? Because it depends on the ICT compatibility, on how effective the business is, even when employees are trying to work remotely and so on. An important factor to COVID-19 was that most of the economies across the world had listed a list of services which were deemed essential for the basic sustenance of the economy, and hence they were exempted from lockdown. On the demand side, what we've seen is that there is a drift in the literature. There are papers which say that there is a direct slump of demand. Why? Because there's income uncertainty and so people don't want to spend a lot. But there is also this other literature which talks about how this demand effect is just a spillover of the supply shock. But even when you see that the supply shock is pervasive across a lot of sectors in the economy, and you have incomplete markets, you have weak institutions, it would eventually unravel an adverse demand shock across most sectors. So what we are hypothesizing is that lockdowns reduce profitability. And why are we saying that? Because revenue shortfalls are rapid and instantaneous. When we want to reduce consumption of a certain good as consumers, we can do it instantaneously. But reducing costs of business is more structural. And when inventories run out, we would see that the profit slump because of the above two features would even deepen. So lockdowns would reduce firm profitability. Now, in the Indian setting, all of us know that on March 25th, the government had announced a 21-day nationwide lockdown. Now, the two striking features of this lockdown was that it was a surprise event with a lot of future uncertainty about when the economy would be opened up or if the lockdown would be extended. And second was a rather fortunate occurrence for people like us who are doing research on industry, which is that the commencement of this lockdown was more or less coinciding with the beginning of the June quarter, which is April 1st. And it lasted for almost 2 of the 3 month quarter. Now, in India, when we focus on performance of firms, while you have to control for all types of firm level factors, we also need to control for the overall environment in which the firm operates. And that is what we bring into our analysis in a more explicit manner by trying to capture the mobility restrictions in the area in which this firm is located. So when we say area, we're focusing on state. And if a firm has a presence in multiple states, we do control for that at all the state levels. Now, in terms of data and variables, we are focusing mostly on the quarterly income statement of all firms for the June 2020 quarter. The other important source of data comes from our Government of India circular, which was dated March 24th, which listed the sectors and industry groups which were deemed as essential. And so these were exempted from the lockdown. So this is the circular which becomes very important for our analysis. We also, to control for the lockdown restrictions, we are looking at the mobility of data at the state level from the Google Community Mobility Database and the spread of COVID-19 infection from the COVID-19 India website. We use data from WPI, from the Reserve Bank of India in order to convert all our variables into real values. Now, because we are focusing on profitability of firms as a dependent variable, we use a host of measures, like 4 specific measures to capture different aspects of profitability of firms. On the exogenous variable side, we have a set of variables like firm age, firm size, leverage, quarterly growth in income, and R&D investment, which could be important to firm performance. We also use dummy variables for ownership, industry group, and location. Unobserved effects, we do control for change in competition over time. And like I said, for controlling, for capturing the mobility during lockdown and COVID-19 infection spread in the area that the firm operates, we do control for the location of firms as state identifiers for 4 of these offices that the firm has, and then the related mobility as well as COVID-19 infection in that. So the final data set would be a quarterly panel data set of firms with industry and state level information. Now, the identification strategy would be something like this. You have data set comprising of 2585 firms in the sample, which reduce a little after cleaning the data. And these are the firms which have disclosed information during the June 2020 quarter. The empirical strategy is to use the Government of India circular, divide the industries into essential and non-essential. And our June 2020 quarter becomes the post-lockdown quarter. And what about our pre-lockdown quarters? We focus on a set of quarters before the announcement. Now, when we're thinking of the quarters before the announcement, we know that there is seasonality across quarters within the same year because of demand conditions, business decisions, and so on and so forth. So what we do is we actually use the same quarter, April to June of all years between 2017 and 2019. So our difference in difference estimation framework would be something like this, where the event is the nationwide lockdown announcement, the post-event is the June 2020 quarter, the pre-event is June 2017, 18 and 19 quarters, and the treatment is the non-essential industry groups that had suffered due to the lockdown, and the control group is the essential ones. So here is our estimation strategy. I'm interested in this coefficient alpha 3, which is the interaction of the time dummy as well as my treatment dummy. Now, we've used robust standard error clustered at the industry, state, and year level, and a host of other form controls that we discussed previously in the slides. Now, the pre-event period has 2017 to 2019. So we'll use 3 models in which 2019 will be the first model, 2018 and 19 the second one, and all 3 in the third one. We just the most important thing to a difference in difference estimation is the parallel trends assumption, which says that my treatment and control group should follow a similar trajectory before the event is announced. So here we are plotting both the treatment and control groups profitability measures for all the quarters, and we see that there is evidence of seasonality for all the 4 measures. But now we just focus on the April to June quarter of the 4 years, and we see that there is a parallel trend where before the announcement is made, there is some sort of similar trend between our treatment and control. In fact, the formal test of parallel trends assumption is also satisfied in our model. Now we come to the main results. Like I said, we have 3 panels. Why? Because here the pre-event period is only 2019, here it's 2018 and 19, and here it's all the 3 years. We can see that across all the measures of profitability, we have a significant and negative coefficient. And across the 3 panels, also we see a similar pattern. So the coefficient of DD is negative and significant at 1% across all models. Profit after tax has declined by 15%, and similarly, other measures have also reduced. Now, the effect size for PAT and profit growth is higher in other panels, because 2019 was typically a period where there was already a reduction in the quarter in all the measures of profitability, right? So we do try to include all the quarters in the pre-event period just to see what happens to our results, and we again find similar results despite having seasonality across all the quarters. Now, it's important to discuss our main results. We know that in the same quarter of June 2020, MOSPI had said that India had had the worst ever contraction in its GDP, falling by 23.9%. Now think about the sample that we are focusing on. Our sample consists of firms which are listed on the stock market and have managed to disclose their financial information at the end of the quarter, even under a lockdown. So it is reasonable to assume that these firms are the least vulnerable group of firms that we are focusing on, and hence are less affected as compared to firms that are facing a complete collapse of production activity and probably closure as well. So a 15% decline in real profits seems to be a reasonable estimate against the 24% decline in overall economic activity. We try a series of robustness tests and our results stay intact. I can talk about the robustness tests in detail in the question and answer session if there are doubts, but I would like to focus on the main channels of the main result. So if you remember, when we were developing the hypothesis, we focused on how the lockdown impacts both the supply and the demand side, but the demand side shock is higher, as a result of which profits decrease. Here we have used measures which capture the supply side as well as the demand side. And we find that although there is a drop in supply side indicators, the decline in demand side is almost double than that of the supply side indicators. I would just like to pass it in mentioning that the supply side indicators that we focus on is the real expenses and expenses growth rate. And for demand side, we're looking at the real income and the income growth. So like I said, there are sharper declines on the demand side, which means firms are struggling to continue operations and hence are losing money, although there is evidence of both demand and supply side being adversely affected by the lockdown. Now, it's important to put this entire result in the context of, the role of what external factor, pre-existing firm-specific factors would have on our result, as well as the local environment that we are focusing on. So here, what we are doing is we're going to interact our DD estimate, our DD coefficient, with that of some sort of heterogeneity at the state level. So we start with how stringent the lockdown was. If you have stringent lockdown, you have lower mobility of labor and hence a higher impact, right? So how do we construct our lockdown stringency variable? We use data on workplace mobility on the first day of the post-event quarter, which is April 1st, 2020, which happens to be a Wednesday. And then we focus on the last Wednesday of this quarter, and we compare workplace mobility for each state on these 2 dates with the national average. So then we define this variable called strict lockdown, which takes a unit value if the state has lower mobility than the national average on both days of the sample, which means that that state had a more stringent lockdown as compared to other states. It's important to capture stringency of lockdown because we know that the level of institutions would be different across the states. And we also know that despite having higher COVID-19 infection, the rate at which a lockdown is implemented would depend on a host of other factors as well. When we do that, we do find that the effect of lockdown stringency on our lockdown effect is much higher, which means that if you have firms operating in areas which have a stringent lockdown, the drop in profitability would be higher, and that stays intact across all our measures of profitability and the 3 panels of our model, our data as well. So the other heterogeneity that we try is COVID-19 spread. We know that COVID-19 is a highly infectious, has a highly infectious nature of the virus. So mobility at times might not just be driven by lockdown stringency, but also the inhibition that people have in terms of stepping out, right? So what we do is we use a similar approach, and we try and capture the spread of COVID-19 cases at the state level in India. Basically, we focus on growth in COVID-19 cases between April 1st and June 30, and we again divide the states into high and low based on the national average growth. We again find a similar result, which states that if the environment in which the firm operates has a rapid growth of COVID-19 spread, then the effect of lockdown on firm performance is much higher. So these two heterogeneity actually underline, these two heterogeneous effects underline the relevance of institutions as well as the external environment in affecting firm performance. Next set of heterogeneity that we focus on is related to the firm level heterogeneity. Now, these firm level heterogeneity are also very important because they talk about the pre-existing factors which basically drive the stringency or the ability of a firm to withstand any sort of shock. We focus on three types of heterogeneity. One is firm age, firm size, and group forms. Now, why is firm age important? Because COVID-19 exposed a type of shock in which firms which are more compatible to ICT would probably have a stronger reason as well as ability to withstand the COVID-19 lockdown effects. So what we do is we categorize firms as old if they have a year of incorporation earlier than the average year of incorporation in that industry. And we find that the effect of lockdown on firm profitability is higher for the older firms and lower for the newer firms, younger firms, right? And again, for firm size, we know that firms which are large in size enjoy a great deal of economies of scale effects, and so they are better equipped to again withstand the effect of a lockdown. So we again categorize firms as big if their total assets in the last financial year is higher than the average assets of all firms in that industry. And we find the expected effect that the effect of lockdown would be higher for smaller firms. Thirdly, we focus on group firms. Why do we focus on group firms? Because group firms have multi-products and hence a presence in several groups of industry. And so again, they can sort of leverage any negative effect by bringing in other products. So we categorize firms as group owned if they belong to some group affiliation. And we find that the effect of lockdown on firm profitability is actually similar for the grouped as well as non-grouped firms. So to conclude, what we find is that lockdowns are essential for averting health consequences, but they have a cost on the economic side. We use the earliest available data and we observe dramatic drops in all profitability measures. The effects are driven by both demand as well as supply shocks. However, the demand shock is much higher, which leads to a decline in profitability. The decline in profitability, more importantly, is higher for firms operating in environments which are characterized by strict lockdowns or have a very high pace of COVID-19 spread. So this underlines the strong role of institutions and external environment in shaping firm performance. Finally, we must we should not underscore the importance of the main result that the effect will be much more pronounced for the entire industrial sector, where firms would probably have faced shutdowns, would have also had effects on other important indicators within the real expenses or real income. So what we push for is that a quick and easy, effective implementation method to avoid a spiraling crisis too widely. How many minutes do I have left?
You're right on time. It's 19 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, then I'll just stop here. I had a couple of way forward, things, but we can skip it for question and answer session if somebody can. Okay, so I'll just stop here. I'm trying to stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ritika, for keeping to the time and yet presenting all your, I think, hopefully the main findings. And then we can pick up stuff at the Q&A. Okay, so now I'm going to invite Nisha. are you? Nisha Vernekar, are you able to? Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you. Can you?
Yeah, we can see her.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it's me. It's me. My problem. I couldn't see. Okay. Yeah, please go ahead. So Nisha will be presenting on the effect of COVID-19 on early childhood.
Right, just give me a second. My laptop has suddenly started hanging. It's not letting me share.
Okay.
Just a second. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to share now. It's working. Yeah. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So I'll be, taking us through this this study that we've done on parental engagement in early childhood education, and it is basically a mixed method study that we've done, which includes some quantitative analysis as well as qualitative analysis. And in this study, we are essentially looking at two programs, one tech and one teacher support program that was being run in early childhood education centers in Urban Maharashtra during the second wave of COVID-19 in the state. So I will just quickly take you through the introduction. I'll then focus a little bit on what the interventions were actually about and how they worked. I'll then take us through the study design and then finally the findings and discussion. So with respect to the context, we know that early childhood education is really being seen and increasingly recognized as something that's very crucial to the overall development of the child, but also as something that has sort of long-term impacts on their earning and learning capabilities. So really, inaccessibility or inequitable access to quality early childhood education is very much an equity concern in education. And within early childhood education, the success of it is also largely determined by the ability of parents to actually engage with the child in the household, because most early childhood education programs, run for only a couple of hours a day, and the learning curve for children in this age group is extremely steep. And of course, at this young age of like 3 to 6 year old, most children can't learn anything independently. So there is need for a caregiver to be present and to actually engage the child in activities. However, even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there are various barriers that prevent caregivers and parents from actually engaging in ECE. And some of these sort of crucial barriers, one is, of course, socioeconomic disadvantage, which really can determine access itself to ECE and educational materials, but also a lack of knowledge on how to actually facilitate learning for the child in the home, what materials to use, what kind of pedagogy, what the actual concepts itself are that a child should be learning at that age. And then secondly, what is most sort of relevant to the school closure context during the pandemic is the low self-efficacy of parents in use of technology for education. So in this study, like I said, we'll be studying two types of programs, teacher support programs and a tech program in two categories of preschools. These are Balwadis and preschool grades of Akanksha Foundation schools. I will go into what exactly both these schools are about, how they run, and what their approach was to continuing EC in the next slide itself. But what we do know is that both these types of preschools were largely designed to target low-income households, and both of them are situated in urban Mumbai and Pune, so very much urban Maharashtra. So like I said, both types of preschools were taking very different approaches to continuing EC during school closures. And through sort of understanding what these approaches were, we have categorized them as being relatively unstructured in the case of Balwadis and more structured in the case of Akanksha schools. And like I said, I'll just explain why in the next slide. And in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, both these types of preschools piloted this structured low-tech program called the e-Pachala program. And that is really, where we sort of start this study from. Before I get into the entirety of the study, this is very much a work in progress. We're really looking forward to a lot of feedback on, how we can improve it and make the analysis slightly more rigorous. So like I said, I'll now take you through exactly what the interventions are about. So this ePathshala program, or the low tech program, is essentially a program where they curate and provide structured and age appropriate digital content for 3 to 8-year-olds. They do this through bite-sized videos shared over WhatsApp. So essentially the system is that you have parents who are added to these WhatsApp groups by their class teachers, parents of course, 3 to 8-year-olds, in our case, 3 to 6-year-olds. They're added onto these WhatsApp groups by their teachers. And on a daily basis, there are these videos that are sent out, which are just short, like 2 to 3 minute videos, or in some cases, even 1 minute videos that basically showcase an adult teaching a child how to do a particular activity that's sort of important for their development. And the content that is shared on a daily basis follows a curriculum it's called the e-Aakar curriculum, which is basically the EC curriculum for the state of Maharashtra, what is often followed in the Anganwadis in Maharashtra. Like I said, there were 2 important innovations of this program that really came out. One is that they are designed so that the materials that are required to conduct the activities are easily available within the household itself. So it's very much targeted to low-income households. And like I said, the videos actually feature an adult teaching a child to do an activity. So the videos are not addressed to the child directly, but rather to the caregiver or any sort of adult who will be doing the activity with the child. Now coming to the 2 EC centers in which the program was being piloted. So I'll start with the Akanksha preschools. So Akanksha Foundation runs about 20 schools in urban Pune and Bombay. Of these, 17 schools have junior KG classes. And what we found during the pandemic through the sort of qualitative interviews with teachers is that Akanksha preschools were running both educational support programs and non-educational support programs across all their schools for all their parents in this age group. As in for kids in this age group. So educational support consisted of live classes. All Akanksha teachers had to do a minimum of 2 live classes a week, and in some cases were doing even up to 4 live classes. And live classes involved both the child, again, because the child is so young, a caregiver was required to be present with the child. And these classes were where the teachers would actually try to teach concepts to the child directly with the sort of facilitation of the caregiver. In addition, they were supplementing these live classes with the ePathshala program, which is where the digital content was coming automatically through that program. In addition, they also were offering what they called, sort of parental engagement programs. Importantly, Akanksha schools had this sort of system of, treating parents as partners even prior to the pandemic. So they specifically had 2 programs designed for parental engagement. One was called parents classes, which is where they would teach the parents the concepts that the child was going to learn over the next fortnight, and then actually teach the parents how to teach the children those concepts, right? So they would teach them a few activities that they could do with their child at home. And these programs were, because they already existed prior to the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, the Akanksha schools essentially had to just adapt these programs for a digital format. So rather than a fortnightly parent class, they would do a weekly parent class over a Zoom call where they would not only teach the concepts, but also clarify doubts on the digital content that was being shared. Because of course, one-way sort of, two-way interaction on the actual content was limited at that point. Secondly, they were providing non-educational support, which was, again, something that they did do even prior to the pandemic. So apart from teachers, Akanksha has social workers that are embedded in the communities from which the children enrolled come from. And they, the teachers would essentially do, I think, fortnightly well-being calls with the parents, where they would sort of, provide moral support, ask them questions about how they were being able to manage the lockdown and how they were being able to manage the, general stressors from the pandemic. But then also they would document any kind of urgent needs of a household. So this included rations, this included devices and internet recharges that households might have needed, for education at that time. They would document these things on a fortnightly basis and share it with their social workers, who would then actually try to provide these materials or support to the households directly. So this was the sort of two-pronged approach that Akanksha preschools were doing. And across all Akanksha preschools, this was the way in which they were supporting parents or parental engagement. So this is really what we call the structured teacher support program in Akanksha preschools. Now, when we compare this to what was happening in Balwadis, so Balwadis, to give you some context, these are basically EC centers run through a public-private partnership model with the Municipal Corporation of Greater Mumbai. And at the time of data collection, there were actually 25 different NGOs running Balwadis in the city, right? And NGOs are given a large amount of flexibility in terms of how they actually provide education. So even when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, NGOs sort of had to take their own approaches in terms of how to move on to digital modes. And what we found was, while there was mention from the different teachers that we spoke to about both educational and non-educational support, any kind of approach that was being taken was very much based on the initiative of an individual teacher or the individual NGO that was running the Balwadi. So for this reason, we have called this the unstructured teacher support program, compared to what was, a much more structured program that was being run in the Akanksha schools. So when we now look at our sample through this lens, and I'll take us through exactly, the sampling strategy in the next slide. But we have this structured tech program that's being run in two types of preschools, which are the Balwadis and Akanksha schools. And in Akanksha schools, every single school was participating in the structured tech program. So we call these the group 3 households or group 3 participants, which were basically receiving both the structured tech program as well as the structured teacher support program. In comparison, in the Balwadis, we actually have two groups of households. So Balwadis, like we said, are doing an unstructured teacher support program. So both group 1 and group 2 are receiving that. However, only group 2 households within Balwadis are receiving the structured tech program. So these are essentially the 3 comparison groups that we use for our analysis, which I will now get into. So the data that we collected was actually collected from mid-April to mid-June 2021. So very much during the peak of the second wave of COVID-19 in the state, and almost completely overlapping as well with the second lockdown that happened in Bombay and Pune. We were able to collect data for about 676 low-income households having a 3 to 6-year-old enrolled in either one of these EC centers, so either a Balwadi or an Akanksha school. The households were randomly sampled from a list that was given for 171 Hindi medium Balwadis, which are actually the Balwadis where the tech program was not being run, and about 249 Marathi Balwadis, which are where the tech program was being run, and then from the 17 Akanksha schools. So the actual sampling for Akanksha schools was quite straightforward. We had a complete list of enrolled students in the junior KG class for that academic year provided from Akanksha schools, and we sort of did a random sampling of them. Teachers were from Akanksha schools were asked to inform the households that the research team would be calling, and we surveyed according to, basically whoever consented to being part of the study was surveyed. With respect to Balwadis, however, the MCGM actually did not have a complete list of enrolled students, and even the teachers or the NGOs that were running the Balwadis didn't have up-to-date contact details of households in their class for a lot of cases. So for this reason, the list of households from which we sampled from Balwadis was actually provided through the e-Pathshala program. And there are certain sort of limitations of taking this approach that I will address on the next slide. With respect to the in-depth interviews we conducted with teachers, we were able to interview 58 teachers across both types of preschools. In Akanksha schools, like I said, there were 17 Akanksha schools with junior KG classes. We were able to interview, I'm sorry, I think this number is wrong. It's 15 junior KG teachers from the Akanksha school. So that's about one teacher in each of the schools. And from the Balwadis, again, we started with a sample of about 30 Balwadi teachers from Marathi medium schools, and 50 from Marathi medium, 30 from Hindi medium Balwadis, to get both the group 2 and group 1 Balwadi teachers. And we're able to collect data for 31 Balwadis that were doing the structured tech program and about 12 that were not a part of the structured tech program. Again, complete list of teachers was provided from the Akanksha schools, and a near complete list was sort of collated. The process was slightly more messy, but we had to collate it through the NGOs and the IPA-Chala program to actually get the numbers for the teachers. Surveys were initially designed to be administered in person, but because it coincided with the second wave and the lockdown, we had to adapt to a telephonic mode of administration. Surveys were conducted in Hindi and Marathi based on comfort of the participant. And similarly for teachers, they were administered in Hindi, Marathi, or English by the research team itself. The data collection tools, so we designed a survey for the households which captured background characteristics both prior to and since the pandemic, educational status of the children in the household, living in the household, as well as parental education. And the main sort of outcome that we're looking at is parent and child engagement with ECE. And finally, we asked them open-ended questions on motivation for parental engagement and their experiences with digital education, but also specifically with the tech program we were studying. And then we had interviews for teachers. So the interview schedules included questions about experiences shifting to digital modes for teaching, using the structured tech program, as well as individual or institutional approaches adopted to motivate parents to engage. So it was through these interview schedules really where we were able to understand the different kind of teacher support interventions that were happening. And from there, we sort of categorized them as both structured and unstructured. So our empirical strategy for the household surveys, we basically assess them using conditional linear regression analysis. So the outcome variables, like I said, were child and parent engagement levels. We collected this through a variety of sort of different variables capturing, frequency of the content share, frequency of engagement with the content. So if you were getting 5 sort of digital content activities a week, of those, how many did you actually participate in the week prior to parental engagement, the actual time spent on education in the week prior to data collection, and a household's willingness to continue participating in the program even once either the program stopped or schools reopened. The explanatory variable, of course, was capturing whether the households belong to group 1, group 2, or group 3. This is, at any point of time, if the groups are confusing, please just stop me and I can repeat what exactly they are. And then control variables, we controlled for the gender and age of the sample child. We controlled for household size. We controlled for the highest educational level attained by the mother of the child, monthly household income, social group, ownership of devices that could be used for education, so specifically computers, smartphones, and TVs. And then the standard errors were clustered at the school or the Balwadi level, because like we said, specifically in the Balwadis, really what the children were receiving was very much based on the specific school that they were attending. And then for qualitative interviews, the transcripts were analyzed through thematic analysis. And we did this across the entire sample, but also within the 3 groups that the teachers belong to. So Balwadis group 1 and 2 and Akanksha schools group 3. Some of the limitations, though, that I think are extremely important to sort of mention. So one is, of course, because the data collection period very much overlapped with the second wave of COVID-19 in Maharashtra, as well as the lockdown, we definitely, one had to switch to this telephonic administration, which was, so harder for us to train our surveyors, and there were a few constraints in terms of even getting through to parents. This also meant that the parents that we were able to ultimately interview were only those that had some sort of network connectivity on the days that we were trying to reach out to them. For these reasons, and possibly the kind of distress that households were facing at that time as well, there was a high attrition rate from the households that were initially sampled to those that who ultimately participated. And for this reason, we went through. Oh, do I only have 2 minutes left, Sanchita?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm going to hurry up. Okay, we can go through these limitations in the actual this thing. But so with the sample description, I'll just very quickly mention that even though we tried to do a random sampling from the 2 types of schools, what we really found is that across socioeconomic indicators, group 1 households and group 2 households, so those in Balwadis, were relatively worse off than the Akanksha schools, which is why in our empirical strategy, we really looked at controlling for sort of differences between the groups. And in our findings, what we ultimately found was that households participating in the structured tech program, so those are group 2 and group 3 households, were more likely to report higher parent and child engagement levels, as well as willingness to participate in the program or continue participating in the program, even after accounting for the socioeconomic and demographic indicators. And households receiving both the structured tech and structured teacher support programs, so these are group 3 households, or the ones in our Kanksha schools, were really reporting the highest engagement levels and willingness to continue the program. And of course, we can't control for the sort of selection and indigeneity concerns that we might have, because as we said, there were lots of issues with the actual sampling strategy that we were ultimately able to go through. So we corroborate this through the qualitative in-depth interviews that we did with the teachers, as well as the open-ended questions we asked the parents. And really what they sort of told us is that both the teacher support program as well as the tech program were really able to alleviate some of the barriers that we see that usually prevent parents from engaging in EC in the household. So for example, they said that, using WhatsApp, it's a low-tech platform, it's familiar, and it's already available in most people's homes. So this really sort of addressed the low self-efficacy of parents in using technology for education. Similarly, they said that the fact that the videos featured an adult teaching a child. Yeah, Sanchita, I'm just done. This is essentially the last slide. But yeah, so essentially this, meant that we were addressing the fact that children, that parents had like less knowledge about how to teach their children. And so therefore they were using this, as a way to, sort of motivated them to be able to teach better. So similarly, there were a couple of other things around that, such as quality of content, the fact that materials were available at home, and also that the tech program actually eased the workload of teachers and allowed them to sort of, help parents more in other ways. And then finally, an important thing is the criticality of providing non-educational support in a structured way, which really helped alleviate some of the other stressors of parents, and therefore parents were sort of enabled to actually prioritize EC in the household. So I'm just going to end it there. I'm so sorry I went a little over time, and we can pick up the rest during question answers.
Okay, thank you, Nisha, and thank you again. For making the effort to keep on time. You were well on time. It's okay. So moving on from early childhood education, now we will have Sushobhan Mahata, who will be talking about the migration decisions of families. So Sushobhan, can you hear? Are you there?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So in that case, the floor is over to you. Thank you.
Yeah. I hope that the slides are visible.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone present here. This is Sushobhan Mahata from University of Calcutta, and I am now going to present my paper on COVID-19 lockdown, family migration, and unemployment in a gender society. Right, co-authored with my doctoral supervisor, late Professor Sarbajit Chaudhuri, and also Rohan Kanti Khan, who later joined us as a co-author. He is also present in the meeting. And as Professor Subhasish already mentioned, that ours is a theoretical or mathematical model. So I am taking liberty to make you all bored, but believe me that I will try to make it easy, even that for a undergraduate or a postgraduate student can also follow. That is my attempt. I will at least try that. So now I am switching off my video because my paper is more interesting than my picture. Yeah. So now moving on to the topic, we all know about how COVID-19 has posed severe challenges, not only to researchers in the field of medicine and natural sciences, but also to policymakers and social scientists. Given the ever-changing nature of the virus and owing to absence of any preventive vaccine or curative medicine, during the initial phase of the crisis, government of various nations resorted to lockdown as an immediate policy response to control the spread of the virus. So basically, this is a motivation and what we provide for our model. When India imposed one of the sudden and strict lockdown in most unplanned manner, more than 120 million workers lost their jobs overnight. Now, majority of these workers were from informal sector, and half of them were women. According to Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, the already low labor force participation rate for women has shrunk even further to 11%. Now, on the other hand, with no work, no money, more than 10 million workers had attempted to reverse migrate. And even after arrival of the new variant, Omicron, several nations are once again thinking about lockdown, although in a different form at a local level. India had already cleared their stand that imposing no further lockdown. Now, this lockdown attempt caused spillover from health pandemic to economic crisis in most nations. Our paper attempts to explain the economic consequences of the pandemic crisis in the form of the effect of lockdowns and its gender aspect. Now, among all other sectors, the most severely affected are those which are contact intensive in nature. Now, beside the usual factor intensity ranking of sectors, we have classified sectors based on their contact intensity. So what is contact intensive? Contact intensive are those sectors in which physical interaction of people is imperative in both consumption and production process. Example, hospitality, industry, vehicle repairing services, tourism, mining, construction, etc. Now, developing countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., where labor market is gendered in terms of male-female wage disparity, lower female labor force participation, then it becomes crucial to take into account this vulnerability while analyzing the effect of COVID-19, this gender aspect. So this is a plan. Now, the research question that we raise, So the research question that we raise against this backdrop are the regional migration of unskilled male and female labor, gender-based wage disparity, female labor force participation, and her burden of unpaid domestic activities, and the rural-urban informalization of workforce. So this is plan of our presentation. The only thing that I desire to highlight at this moment is that we have classified 4 types of unskilled families based on their migration pattern. If both unskilled male and female stays together in the rural area, we classify it as rural with family, RWF in short. And if the male and the female member lives in the urban area, then it's urban with family, UWF. And if they live apart, separate from each other, either in the urban or rural area, we classify it as without family. Now let's begin the model. The representative developing economy that we construct has been characterized as follows, that there are 2 broad regions, the rural region and the urban region. In the rural region, there is the agriculture sector. We term it as sector 1. The agriculture sector uses unskilled male, unskilled female labor and land. And the figure within the parentheses are the respective factor prices or the factor returns. In the urban area, we have 3 sectors. Sector 2 is a formal manufacturing sector. It uses unskilled male and capital. We have a non-trade service sector that is also in the urban region. Unskilled male, female, and capital are used. And a high-skill service sector that uses skilled labor and capital. So basically, we classify sector 2 and sector N as contact-intensive sector. One might question that why agriculture is not contact-intensive or high-skill service. See, for high-skill service, it's obvious that work from home is an alternative option. So it's basically not a contact-intensive in that sense. In the agriculture sector, there was no such restriction imposed by the government. This is the first reason. And the second is that in the agriculture fields are usually large. So you can see that laborers are working at different positions, which are far distant, sufficiently distanced. So in that sense, that we do not classify it as contact intensive. Now we conceptualize lockdown as restriction on physical gathering of human labor denoted by psi that belongs to the interval 0 to 1. Now 0 means no lockdown and 1 means complete lockdown and complete restriction. And if any fraction, for example, if psi is 0.6, that will imply that 60% of labor force is restricted to be present physically at their workplaces. Second, lockdown imposed high transaction cost denoted by capital T, that is a positive function of psi. For example, in absence of transportation, firms had to bear the cost of bringing labor to their workplaces, cost of sanitization, cost of maintaining other health protocols. And if there is a complete lockdown, that is psi is equal to 1, this transaction cost that is dependent on this intensity of lockdown will exceed the price level. Therefore, it will become difficult for the firm to survive. And third, how we conceptualize lockdown is that urban cost of living, high urban cost of living. that is denoted by zeta, that is positive function of psi. And fourth, the lockdown has impacted adversely the demand side, that is the demand for local non-trade commodities. Specifically in our model, we consider the negative demand shock for female specific services, such as babysitting, housemaid, etc. Now, the first paper in this session has already provided sufficient empirical background for our theoretical model, and we are grateful for that. Now, as already mentioned, we have here two broad family groups, the unskilled poor household and the elite skilled household. In the unskilled household, the female time distribution between unpaid domestic work and wage earning activities is decided from the intra-household bargaining problem. However, the male member has a final say in the migration decision about migrating with or without family. So basically, it represents a patriarchal type society where male member takes the final call about migration. The role of elite skilled household is limited to endogenous determination of demand for unskilled female services. So unskilled female are providing their labor services in the urban area, and those labor services are demanded by the skilled families. Now, these are few of the notation that I have already clarified. So VF and VM are the respective unskilled female and male's utility function. That is basically a log linear type utility function. LFG is a female's time in unpaid work. EF is her time in the labor market. And capital G is a household public good, the production of which is described in equation 3. So basically, what is equation 3? The female labor are providing a part of their unpaid work, LFG, and male member are providing a fraction of their income. Using these two combination, G is produced. G is a household public good. The interesting point is the term gamma M in this equation, gamma M. So gamma N captures the pride heart of the male member due to female participation in the labor market outside home. You see that if EF is a female labor force participation, if EF goes up, given the negative sign and given that gamma M is positive, VM, the male's utility function, will fall. So gamma M represents the pride heart of the male member. And this is a collective household optimization problem from intra-household bargaining, where omega and 1 minus omega, the respective bargaining strength of the male and the female member. And the optimization problems gives us the following equilibrium values. And we have equation 6 that represents the indirect utility function, that is quasi-convex. And similar exercise had been carried out for urban household who are living with their families, and for the urban household who are living without their families, and the rural household who are living without their families. So these are basically the equilibrium condition. I'm not going through that. And what are the differences between our migration equilibrium and that of Harris-Choudhury 1970? Most of us are well aware of that paper, and Chaudhuri and Khan 1993 paper that was published in Econometrica. So the differences are that in our model, families are heterogeneous. That is, some are staying with their families, some are without their families, some are migrating with their wife, while few others are not. So this heterogeneity among the families are captured in our migration equilibrium condition. As already mentioned, male's pride heart is when the female member goes out of the house to participate in the labor market. So this term of pride heart also enters into our migration decision, and hence in the migration equilibrium. Now, finally, that it is a family-based migration decision, unlike the Harris-Choudhury and Chaudhuri and Khan equilibrium. And open unemployment exists even in presence of the informal sector, because informal sector is usually the residual sector. It absorbs the remaining of the unemployed workers into it. So even if there is presence of the urban informal sector, open unemployment exists in our model. And so these are the final migration equilibrium which we obtain by comparing the indirect utility function under different conditions. In the similar fashion, the intra-household optimization of the elite skilled families leads to endogenous determination of demand for non-trade female services, that is denoted by X and G. So X and G is a demand by a unit skilled family. Demand for what? Demand for the non-traded female services. So now we have considered two general equilibrium situations, one in which the male member migrate with families and the other in which male member migrate without their family. So this is a first structure. These are all the first order condition of profit maximization in each of the industry that I have already described. In equation 24, T of capital psi captures a transaction cost owing to lockdown. So basically the left-hand side represents a cost functions, and the right-hand side is a unit revenue or marginal revenue. And in sector 2, it has to face a transaction cost, negative transaction cost. Equation 28 describes a capital market imperfection that is a crucial feature of any developing economy. The informal interest rate is denoted by eta, that is a positive markup over the formal interest rate, right? So if I may exceed the time, I request that since it is a very big paper, just 2 to 3 minutes extra can be provided to me. That is my request just. So equation 28 gives a capital market imperfection, that is informal interest rate is a markup over formal interest rate. Equation 31 captures unemployment of male unskilled labor, which is conditional on the intensity of lockdown. See, if psi is 0, no lockdown, that means no open unemployment. Everyone is absorbed in informal sector. If psi is 1, then there is unemployment. And for any fraction, the unemployment is fractional. And finally, in equation 37, this psi represents the negative demand shock. If psi increases, the demand will fall, negative function. Now, we have derived many results of lockdown on female labor force participation, gender-based wage disparity, migration decision. Now, all results I have summarized. The results are summarized in this table. So you can see that there are actually different types of effect on urban unemployment, rural migration, informalization, and female labor force participation. So this row-wise, it represents a different comparative statistics or different effects of lockdown that we have carried out on 2 situations. One is migration with family and migration without family. We have many different types of mixture of results. So basically, what we do is that what we really observed during the COVID era. So we have observed the mixture of results. We have the final output, but we have in this paper segregated each of the effect on lockdown, and we have obtained these results. Now, the extension that we are working on is what could be the policy retaliation or what could be efficient policy retaliation. So one, we are looking at agriculture price subsidy, whether agriculture price subsidy can absorb the excess burden that was coming from the urban area, or it may provide a counterproductive result. Second, we are looking at capital market reform in terms of lowering the skew that will lower the informal and formal interest rate by curbing down monopoly power or increasing the capital supply in many different forms. And next, that we are looking on that increase in capital influx by the government, that government has already done. So whether it has some positive, negative, or ambiguous effect that we are looking on. And lastly, we are looking on a cash transfer that will accentuate the demand. So these are the policy analysis that we are carrying on. I am just ending in 1 minute. So that's all my presentation. And what are the limitation of our paper? The limitation is our subjectivity and subjectivity of our unit of analysis. That is a human beings that we are considering. Subjectivity in terms of choice of the model that we have chosen. The choice of the school of thought, we are following a neoclassical school of thought. That is also our subjectivity and our limitation. And the unit of analysis that the human beings on we are doing our paper, that is also a subjective human being. So that is also our limitation. Now, this subjectivity is not only limitation of our analysis, but a major limitation to all field of social sciences and policy making and the science of policy making. People rarely accept that this is a limitation because they have to show that this is a modern science or a policy science. So that's, however, I raise a question that I am still confused about, that is whether this subjectivity is really a limitation or it opens a new venture of science altogether. So that's all my presentation. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you, Sushobhan. Again, I mean, thank you to all of the presenters. We started a little late, but you all made an attempt to stay on time, and I really admire that. And the fruit of all that is we have 22 minutes left for question and answers. So I'm going to now invite questions from the floor. So questions, please, for our 3 presenters. I have one question here on the chat box, but I'd like to collect questions. Questions? If you have questions, please just unmute yourself and questions. Okay, then let's take this question. This question is for Sushobhan, and you can read it on the chat box. So this question is posed by Anushil Das, and Anushil's question is the following: in your household modeling part, you have assumed that there is no disparity among skilled workers. It's okay that you've assumed disparity among unskilled, but why not skilled workers? So why no disparity among skilled workers in your assumption? So that's one question for you, Sushobhan. And the second question is from Shonchita, and she wants you to say a little bit more about the policy implications of your work.
Yeah, I get the question. And if the Onusil Das has question, so Onusil, can you identify yourself? Then it will be a better discussion.
Yeah, so hello. So I'm Anushil. So currently I'm pursuing my postgraduate in economics in West Bengal, and a few months ago I have just completed my graduation from St. Xavier's University, Calcutta.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So basically I get your question. See, any kind of theoretical modeling is an abstraction from reality, some kind of abstraction from reality we have to make, right? So in that sense, we have not assumed any disparity among skilled workers, because you see that when this kind of COVID-19 shock or any kind of economic shock appears for a developing and a backward economy like India or its neighboring countries, the effect is more intense for the unskilled families, right? For the unskilled or the informal labor force. So for the skilled families or the skilled labor force, they can absorb some of the shocks. Even the skill can choose to remain unemployed. There is a theory, that luxury unemployment hypothesis. You can search it. So the skilled families can even choose to remain unemployed by their choice. But the unskilled household, they have no choice. They either get absorbed in the informal sector, or this kind of COVID shock that has shown us the new way that this kind of lockdown in the physical and restricting physical interaction has even hindered the informal sector from absorbing the shock. Basically, in theory, we call informal sector as a shock absorbing sector. So during the COVID era, we see that even the shock absorbing sector could not absorb the shock, right? So it is the unskilled or the informal labor who are more vulnerable. So basically that has to be modeled very sensitively. So that's the reason that we have considered disparity among unskilled workers, although we accept that there exists sufficient disparity of female labor force participation, gender-based wage disparity among the skilled labor also, but that is not as much as vulnerable as the unskilled labor. So that's my response. So I hope that it clarifies.
Okay, there was another question on the policy implications.
Yeah,
basically, if you can talk about it in a little more detail.
Yeah. So do I need to share the slides once again, or I can just continue?
I think you can just continue. I mean.
Yeah. So see, there are two kinds of policy that we are looking at. The first one is we are trying to explain the pandemic crisis, right? We are trying to explain the pandemic crisis, how it appeared in the economy, and what are the channels that it came into the economy and different sectors. So in that sense, what we have done, that first one in the form of high transaction cost. High transaction cost, why? Because during the COVID era, or COVID-19, the COVID era is also continuing now also, there was a supply chain disruption. As I already mentioned, that supply chain disruption in terms of increasing the transportation cost or various kind of transaction cost that a firm has to face. So that was the increase in transaction cost that I first dealt with, right? The second one is that the negative or the adverse demand shock. The adverse demand shock, the first presenter has already clarified using her empirical model. So that was also very obvious. The third one that I looked upon was the physical restriction of labor gathering. That is, if labor is restricted, for example, during that time, government was declaring different rules. For example, 60% of the labor could not participate at their workplaces, or 40% or 50%. So that is a restriction put on physical gathering of labor. So this restriction has impacted only the contact intensive sector. I am quoting the contact intensity, because because sectors in which physical interaction is necessary, otherwise production cannot be done. So those are contact intensive, and there was restriction that was felt, right? Physical restriction. That contact intensive or that restriction has not affected in that manner the high skill sector. So that we looked upon, because if there is such kind of restriction, people are moving out of those contact intensive sector to some different sectors, the agriculture sector, where there was no such strict regulation. And having said all this explains the pandemic crisis, right? So lastly, what we look upon is a policy, the corrective policy measures. What could be the corrective policy measure? So in that we looked at agriculture price subsidy, because the burden was faced by the rural sector. People moved from the urban to the rural area. So how that burden can be absorbed unless you provide some kind of expansionary policy for the agriculture sector, that burden cannot be absorbed, because you are on one hand the government is restricting the industries in the urban area, on the other hand there is no rural support. Then how that can be improved? So the agriculture price subsidy might help the agriculture sector to expand, and if it expands, it can absorb the excess burden. And the other way is that by some credit market policy, right? Because we know that the farmers or the agriculture sector obtains credit from the informal sector, and how informal sector provides credit at a higher informal interest rate. That is usually a markup over formal interest rate, and this can be modeled in variety of ways using a simple principal agent type model to a monopolist money lender model and lender risk hypothesis. So there are a wide variety of models that describes that why informal interest rate is a markup over formal interest rate. So markup means difference. Informal interest rate is high compared to the formal interest rate. Now, if government can curb down this gap, can reduce this gap between informal and formal interest rate by lowering the informal interest rate, then that can also provide an impetus to the agriculture sector to expand and absorb the excess burden. So these are two policy measures that the government that is expected to make situation better in the rural area. And the other policy that everyone talked about is a cash transfer to increase the demand for different types of commodities. So increasing that demand can also lower some of the negative consequences of COVID-19. So that are the policy that we are still going on.
Okay, thank you for the very detailed responses. Questions? More questions for Sushobhan or for the other presenters?
Good afternoon. I have a question.
Yes, please, Shekhar.
Yes. So I have a question that the presenter has said that there could be subsidy for the farmers. And in that light, I just want to ask, while doing their survey or while collecting the data, have they come across the positive impact of the PM Kisan Samman Nidhi? Because it is a cash transfer to the farmers. And if I'm not wrong, post this election, it got started in Bengal. So was there any of the data coming or the views coming from the farmers? Yes.
So I think I can just rephrase Shekhar's question for Sushobhan, because theirs is not exactly an empirical paper. I guess, Sushobhan, the question that Shekhar is asking is, given your theoretical framework, how would you evaluate the actual sort of policy that was implemented? I mean, in your framework, you're thinking of the policymaker as a welfare maximizing person and so on, right? But in the real world, a certain kind of program is adopted. So how would you evaluate that program? If you have something to share on that.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you, Professor Subhasish, for clarifying that ours is a theoretical paper more and not in that sense an empirical paper. But how can we model this kind of policies? See, even if this policy will have some expansionary effect on the agriculture sector, so that we can just bring in some parameters in terms of the demand for the agriculture sector, right? In our model, in the context of our model, since I'm talking about my model in this stage, so in our model, agriculture sector is an export-oriented sector, right? And we have assumed a small open economy, small open developing economy. So in case of a small open economy, the prices of the traded sectors are determined in the world market, right? Without the domestic market. because a small economy has a less share in the world trade volume. So the prices are determined in the world market. The small economy has no control over it. So even if demand for agriculture sector, demand from the agriculture sector goes up, the demand will increase, but it will not increase the price level. Why? Because in our model, as I mentioned, the price is already determined from the world market. If we assume that a part of agriculture sector is produced locally and consumed locally, non-trade, that is true, of course, empirically, then we can have a expansionary demand for policy that we can take into account. And the counterpart that we have taken in this model is a demand by the skilled household. And we are making a cash transfer that I have shown that cash transfer will accentuate the demand. Accentuate the demand means price level will go up, profitability will increase, employment is expected to increase, and other general equilibrium effects will be there. So this can be considered. Yeah.
Okay. Now we have some questions. Let me ask the couple of questions to the other presenters, and Shunchita also has a question for Nisha. So I'm just going to tag along my questions. So one question for Ritika. If you could just clarify, I mean, this difference in difference seemed a little unusual to me, because you're doing quarter to quarter comparison. So what then happens to the intervening time period? I may have missed something. Is this a very unusual way of doing difference in difference? If you can just comment on that. And question for Nisha: how much of a problem is it that all the what you call group 1 schools, I think, are only have education in one medium, which is Hindi medium, and not in Marathi? And also sort of tagging on another question by Shunchita for Nisha: did you see any explicit difference in learning outcomes among the three groups? So maybe Ritika can start, and then Nisha can answer our questions, the other questions.
Yes, sure. I'm so sorry, but Dr. Subhasish, can you just repeat the question I missed?
No. I was just saying that it was a bit the difference. I mean, the comparison you're making is quarter to quarter, right? So you're saying compare.
Right.
How unusual is this? And then and if you could just go back to the parallel trends diagram, I just wanted to see if you can put that up again.
Right. Sure. I'll just do that. I mean, in when you're doing firm level studies, what happens is that if I had annual data, I'm working with quarterly data, quarterly income statements of all the firms.
Right.
So what happens is that if I consider, I'll just use this graph to sort of reiterate my point. So basically, if I'm looking at all the quarters within a year, there is substantial seasonality. Why? Because in the first quarter, it is possible, like the first financial quarter would be April to June. The kind of demand in that quarter would be very different from the festival demand for certain sectors. As a result of which you see a lot of seasonality within the year for the same quarter. Also, when we think about the decisions that firms make, in the first financial quarter, the amount that will be allocated for certain activities would be very different from the third or the fourth quarter, depending on. So because of which, the typical thing that is done in all corporate finance studies would be to actually take the same quarter and then track it over the years. So here, that's why when I'm showing the parallel trends between the treatment and the control group of firms, what we see is when I'm plotting all the quarters, there is substantial, like some sort of pattern within the year. But as soon as I consider only April to June for 2017, for 2018 and 2019, it sort of smoothens out because these are real values. So that's why. So it is over time, but it's just not like all the quarters, but just like those quarters, the same quarters, which is called the quarter on quarter instead of year on year.
I see. So I guess so in your diagram, yes, you have June 2017, and then again June 2018. Okay. Right. And you're just joining those points. And
exactly.
Okay. Right. So this is pretty. So this is. I'm sorry, I'm not from corporate finance. So this is pretty standard, like.
Yes, this is standard. And the red line over here does not denote the lockdown announcement, but more like the pre and post division. So anything till June 2019 would be considered as the pre-event, because the post-event is only after June 2020, April 2020. So this becomes my post-quarter and this becomes my pre-event. And in fact, Yeah. In fact,
so wait, but it's just one question then. So, but the sort of treatment is COVID, right? COVID-19.
Right. The event, I would say the event is COVID-19 lockdown announcement. The treatment is those group of industries which were not in the March 25th circular.
Okay, so COVID-19 lockdown announcement is the event.
Yes.
So if you can just go back to your graph again, just sorry.
Right. No. Yes. Or maybe which
the one where you had the so that's okay, but you are treating okay, so but technically you're treating it as June 2019. That's your sort of event line.
No, so exactly, that's why I'm saying when we look at these diagrams, it makes sense because here this red line is the lockdown announcement. This is the event. In this particular figure, I cannot identify the event because the event is I mean, it's between this and this. So what happens is that this red line works as dividing the entire period into pre and post. Just that the lockdown announcement was not on the red line that is being shown in this figure.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I was a little confused. A little. Yes, and you wanted to clarify some things as well. Please take this opportunity.
Yes. Just a last point that I mean, because there is this entire ambiguity whether I should consider only the April to June quarter of all the years, or should I consider all quarters? That's why, as a robustness check, we re-estimate our models. That's why the number of observations over here is very large, because I've considered all observations or all the quarters before April to June 2020 as my pre-event window, and there also I find similar results. So just to like sort of reiterate.
Okay, yeah, all and your coefficients are all the same, is it? I mean, like it's the effect size is the same.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
more or less.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Nisha, can you please your response?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just do Sanchita's question first. So, the original design actually involved us studying both parental engagement as a sort of mediating variable, and then learning outcomes was going to be our actual, variable of interest. But what really ended up happening is because we couldn't do physical administration, we decided that we won't be able to do learning outcomes at that point of time. So the original design was that this study would be our baseline. We would collect learning outcomes, and then we would go back after about 8 months, but that has not been possible as of yet. So that's sort of the short answer there, Sanchita. With respect to your question, so, the households that we sampled from the Hindi medium Balwadis. So the reason we chose Hindi medium is because we wanted a sort of counterfactual to the Marathi Balwadi where the tech program was going on. We chose Hindi medium because socio-economically, if we sort of look at literature, the students attending the Hindi medium and the Marathi or the local language medium Balwadis tend to be sort of similar when compared to like an Urdu medium Balwadi or a English medium Balwadi. So that was our initial reason for doing that. What we also found though is that the households that we ultimately sampled from the Marathi medium Balwadi, there were some that had not stopped participating in the actual program. So the group 1 households are not cleanly from only Hindi medium Balwadis. They're a mixture of Hindi medium and Marathi medium Balwadis where they weren't doing the tech program. Essentially where they weren't added to the WhatsApp groups. So like I said, because the list given to us was not entirely clean, this is sort of what ended up happening. And the reason that we got, sorry.
No, so I was saying, but which was the group that only had the Hindi medium Balwadi?
So basically what happened is, so it was group 1 was predominantly Hindi medium Balwadis, but also some Marathi medium Balwadis. Group 2 was only Marathi medium Balwadis.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that makes it a little bit clearer. As far as teacher sampling, it was much cleaner.
Okay. So group 2 was the only Marathi.
Correct. Yes.
Only Marathi medium Balwadis. And I'm just trying to wrap my, and the reason for that being, if you could just say it again.
Yeah, so the reason for that is because we were sort of looking at, if you had to pick out of the sort of like the Balwadis that were not doing the tech program, right? The different medium that were available to us from which we could select. So there was English medium, Urdu medium, there was Hindi medium, and then there was a smattering of a small number of sort of other regional languages for migrants. So there was Kannada, Telugu, you know, a bunch of these other ones. So we said out of the English, Hindi, and Urdu ones, closest to Marathi medium in terms of socioeconomic background.
But I guess then just backing off a little there, I guess the question then is, because I don't know the context, right? So why is it that the schools that don't have the program were all non-Marathi? I mean, how did that happen? I mean, why is it that?
So, because when MCGM signed this contract, they said, let's pilot it in a small number. And their reasoning to, as in their way of managing that small number and selecting the small number was based on medium. So this is an entirely external decision that we just said, okay, let's use that then.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Some Marathi Manus kind of stuff, like only choose.
Maybe, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Any other questions? Any other questions from the floor? Okay, I think
Hello,
we've
Professor
also come.
Subhasish.
Yeah, there is
Hello.
a question. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make one clarification on the point that you raised, that about welfare maximization. That
yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
You get the final word. It's at 3 p.m. So you get the final word. Go ahead.
Yeah, I understand that after this has a lunch break and we have all to eat. So basically, see that politicians are not actually welfare maximizer. Neither they are benevolent. That I believe, and they are guided by vote politics in a democracy and power retention politics otherwise. And I strongly disagree with my assumption of the paper that government is benevolent welfare maximizer and choosing policy by maximizing the welfare. That I strongly disagree, and that assumption is there in my paper and also in many different literature. Therefore, what I am attempting right now is to model the government, right? Modeling the government who maximizes a weighted average of political payoff. Political payoff includes the payoff from winning the re-election bid and the weighted of economic welfare. So basically government's aggregate payoff, it is a particular weight times the political payoff plus another weight and times the economic welfare. Now, you can find one of these in that situation, the government maximizes its aggregate weighted utility and chooses a policy parameter. So there we break the assumption of benevolency of government or welfare maximization of government. And you can find one of these attempt in an upcoming paper that I have co-authored with Professor Sarbajit Chaudhuri and Professor Krishnendra Doshidar of JNU, and that is coming in managerial and decision economics. And another of this variant is going to be presented in today evening in this session only at the Jindal School of Public Policy, crime corruption paper that you can find. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. No, yeah, I basically was just trying. I thought the spirit of Shekhar's question was to say that, okay, this is the policy that exists. And what do you, in your framework, how do you evaluate that policy? And what you have told us is like that, it can increase aggregate demand provided certain conditions are satisfied. And I think you've answered that question. I think quite well. Thank you very much.
I was just adding to your point of whether government is a welfare maximizer or not. So actually, government is not a welfare.
You're saying you already have some results where you do have that assumption.
That we are
and you have
already working
evaluated policy implications under those under a more complex or let's say more realistic assumption. And
more
this
realistic and more
decision and managerial economics. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, thank you everybody for attending our first panel at this conference. We will now break for half an hour and then we will come back for the next panel. So thank you everybody. Thank you to all the three presenters for being so excellent with time.